Welcome to Skullface Horror Stories. This is where you come when you and yours want to get scared. This video is brought to you by Scream For Me Inc. Are you looking for some of the best horror merch around? Check out screamformeinc.com. They have hundreds of different patch designs. They have wallets, bags, hats, phone cases, and yeah, even home decor. And the best part is, if you don't see what you're looking for, they do custom items too. Just go to the contact section, email them, and they'll be happy to help you out. And for all of my awesome viewers, they're giving a 10% discount on everything. Just enter in the discount code Skullface during checkout. This is a story called Ever Since That Night with Tom, I Can't Risk Sleeping in the Same Spot Twice. "Dad," he whispered, his voice weak. Then he shouted, "Dad, I told you I don't want to join. You didn't want to join. Leave me alone." "We've been searching for so many years," the chorus of voices said. I think we should take a step back and see how we got here." I flipped to a new page in my paperback, doing my best to ignore the buzz from the linoleum lights overhead. 3 a.m. at a Denny's, and I had the place all to myself, aside from the cook who'd just returned from the drugstore with a fresh pack of smokes. When normally busy restaurants are empty, they get an odd feeling that I don't fully understand. I'd only been working here for a few weeks, so the small creaks and groans of the kitchen were unfamiliar enough to occasionally pull my attention from my book. Still, I recognized the telltale chime of the door opening. I got to my feet, glad the cook had made it back before a customer did. A nearly 7-foot-tall man stood in the lobby, looking out through the glass windows towards the swaying trees in front of the restaurant. I grabbed a menu, put on my best waitress smile, and walked toward the door. "Hi, welcome to Denny's," I said, leading him to a booth. "Can I get you anything to drink?" "Water's fine," he said. His voice was deep and sonorous like a perfectly tuned bass guitar. I paused, something inside me recognizing that voice. "Tom?" I asked. He swung his head to look at me, wide-eyed. "April?" I smiled wide. "It's been, 15 years? He returned the smile, the same smile he'd used when we were both teenagers and he almost got caught stealing his dad's beers for our friend group. "What are the odds?" he said with a laugh. A high school reunion at 3 a.m. in a Denny's. "Hang on," I said. "Let me grab that water. You know what you want to eat?" "Eggs and hash browns would be lovely," he said. I returned with a glass of water and slid into the seat opposite him. "So, what have you been up to?" I asked. He pulled out his wallet and flipped open a roll of photos. I took it, flipping through them. Most were of a small Yorkie and Tom at various famous landmarks in the U.S., the Grand Canyon, the Seattle Space Needle, Arches National Park, New York City, and more. "Love that dog," I said, handing them back. "So you've been doing some traveling then?" "It comes with a profession," he said, stuffing his wallet into a pocket. "I've been a truck driver for 15 years now." The cook slapped the bell in the back, the signal that Tom's food was done. I got up and brought it back, then watched in amazement as Tom scarfed it all down in under a minute. "You hungry?" I asked with a laugh. He suddenly looked self-conscious. I typically eat fast. Helps me get back on the road." He shot another long look out the wide windows towards the trees, swaying underneath the streetlights near his semi-truck at the end of the otherwise deserted parking lot. "My shift is almost over," I said. "You should come up to my place for a drink." "That sounds great." I clocked out a few minutes later, then drove us both up towards my place. "When's your next delivery?" I asked as the car wound back and forth up through the woods. "Not for a few days," he said. "I dropped off my shipment a few hours ago." "And where's home for you?" I asked. "Home is inside that truck," he said with a laugh. I turned to look at him. His frame was almost comically large inside my little sedan. "How do you mean? You don't have a house?" He shook his head. "I prefer to keep on the move." "Why?" He opened and then he closed his mouth. then turned to look out the window again. It just always seemed like the right thing to do. My house was dark when I pulled up. An hour later, Tom and I had raised our BAC to a tolerable level and were playing cards at my dinner table. I tossed a card down, my head buzzing pleasantly. "So you don't have a place?" I asked. "How long have you lived out in your truck?" Tom took another swig of beer. "Ever since I started, baby. I swapped trucks a few times during that period, though." I shook my head. "But why? You drive all over, which means you could live wherever, right? Don't most truck drivers have schedules with days off?" He flicked a card down onto the table. He moved with an almost gentleness, like he was afraid of breaking something. "You're going to think I'm crazy," he finally said. "Honey, I'm a waitress at Denny's," I said. "You don't have the imagination to say anything crazier than what I've already personally experienced." He gave a humorless chuckle. "Well, all right then." He held up his bottle and swirled what remained of his beer. "If we're going there, I'm going to need something stronger than this." I got to my feet and pulled out a bottle of whiskey I kept above my fridge alongside 2 shot glasses. I poured one for each of us. He drowned his immediately, then I filled it back up. "You remember my dad?" he started. "He was a truck driver like I am. He was also a tweaker. Hard drugs aren't uncommon with truck drivers. It keeps you awake during those long, middle-of-the-night hauls. But my dad didn't just use them as a tool. He used them all the time. He was crazy." I nodded. I'd only met his dad once or twice, but I remembered getting a weird vibe. Tom stared down at the amber liquid in the shot glass. "The thing is, my dad was convinced that something was after him, that this thing, whatever it was following him all the time, that if he ever stayed in one place for more than a day, it'd get him." I leaned forward, nodding. "You remember Ashley? Similar story. She ended up staring into the sun for hours looking for insights into a higher plane of reality. It's crazy what that stuff can do to you." I paused. "But Tom, that explains your dad. What about you?" "My dad," he continued, "went missing a few months after I graduated. Around that time, I saw..." Tom cut himself off, downing the rest of his drink. I leaned forward. "You saw something? Like something that was after your dad?" "I think so," he said. "It was very dark and I just ran away, but yeah." My mind raced. "So I mean, Tom," I rubbed at my face, "you've never bought a house because your dad was convinced something was following him? And you think it might be after you now?" Tom looked up to me, his face scrunched up with a cringe. "They never found his body, but even so, it sounds downright crazy, doesn't it?" I thought back to how he'd wolfed down the food at the Denny's. "Is that why you always eat so fast?" He gave a bark of laughter, then a rueful nod. "You must think I'm an absolute nutcase." "Tom, everyone's a nutcase in one way or another." My mind swam back to Brad, my abusive ex-boyfriend. "If this is the way that you're broken, I think you should be grateful. There are far worse ways people can break." I drank my shot, cringing as it burned my throat, and silence hung in the air for a long moment. "What did it look like?" I asked. "Whatever you think you saw." Tom shuddered, the motion running through his entire body. "Don't ask me. I can't even be sure. And it was almost 20 years ago." "Fair enough," I said, getting to my feet. "You're not crazy, Tom. Not in any way that matters." A wave of sleepiness washed over me, and I straightened. "I'm going to turn in for the night. Couch is there. Bedroom's over there." Tom shot a glance through the kitchen window. He nodded, then carried his glasses over to the sink. The next morning, I found him sitting by the front door. Tom said, shaking his head. "For 20 years, I've never spent more than one day in the same town, you know." "I understand," I said. "I can drive you back to your truck as soon as the coffee's done." "No, that's not what I meant," he said. "I don't want to let my dad's demons take me over too. I want to get over this fear I have." "Well, I don't have work today," I said, stepping into the kitchen. "If you want, we can find something to do. There's a few hikes in the mountains near here. That sounds nice. I think I'm going to feel a little jumpy is all. That's fine, I said. We'll bring the bottle of whiskey with us and make a picnic of the whole thing. I found it smooths me out. He gave a ghost of a grin. All right, deal. We set out a few hours later. I drove, taking us up into a section of pine forest that I'd explored a few times when I was younger. The hike went well, but I could tell Tom's head would swivel around whenever he thought I wasn't looking. We reached a grassy field and sat down for a picnic. Tom slowly relaxed as the sun set. It's hard to feel too oddly protective of him, and the thought of feeling protective of a man more than twice my size nearly made me laugh. When the sun had set, we sat back down the trail. I had a moderately powerful flashlight in one hand, lighting the moist, spongy soil. We talked in quiet voices as we walked. I cut myself off, listening hard. Tom. A voice called out again from ahead, further down the trail. Tom. This time it seemed that a dozen voices had joined the first, forming a chorus, as if they were some kind of search party. I turned to Tom to ask if he invited anyone, when the question died on my lips. Tom was staring down into the darkness of the trail with an expression of horror so pure that goosebumps broke out over my whole body. He let out a low moan, then took a step backward. Tom, the voice called out through the trees. We've been looking for you, Tom. Join us. Dad? Dad? He whispered, his voice weak. Then he shouted, Dad, I told you I don't want to join. You didn't want to join. Leave me alone. We've been searching for so many years, the chorus of voices said. Tom, I said. His entire demeanor was different. Up until now, his voice had never once wavered. He'd never once appeared nervous, never seemed afraid. I turned back down the trail. Who is that? I shouted into the darkness. Tom began babbling like a child from behind me. Join us, the chorus repeated, now even closer. I heard the spray of loose soil and turned to watch Tom run into the forest off to my right. I began running after him. I slipped on some soil and I face planted. Tom, I called out, struggling to my feet. I brushed the dirt off myself and stumbled forward, but soon lost his figure between the trees. Eventually, I gave up and slowed to a stop. I had no idea who this group was or why they were after Tom. It sounded like a bunch of cultists. The way they'd all spoken in unison still made my skin crawl. Tom, I called out into the woods. I'm heading back and calling the police. I turned around and began trekking through the woods back towards the trail. I'd passed the first trail marker when I heard Tom's voice. April, he called out from behind me. Oh, I breathed out a sigh of relief and turned around. Tom, are you okay? I finally see April, he said in his deep, sonorous voice. I've never been better. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, illuminating the source of his voice, something that my mind didn't fully understand at first. A mound of flesh came streaming between two pine trees like a viscous fluid. The surface of the fleshy mound was covered with dozens and dozens of faces, each missing its eyes. One of them was fresh, still dripping with blood. Tom's face. His mouth opened and his voice, the voice that reminded me of a bass guitar, came echoing through the forest. You should join us, April. Each of the other faces opened their mouths too. They spoke in unison. Join us, April. We want you to join us. Each face was recognizable with unique facial expressions. Then, the fleshy mound moved forward, like curdled milk spilling out of a barrel, each face continuing to beg me to join them as it slurried across the ground towards me. The smell emanating from this thing was almost sour, like body odor and spoiled milk. I sprang away like a deer, and the next 5 minutes passed in a blur of running. As the voices faded into the distance, I forced myself to slow. If I twisted an ankle, I'd have no chance. I'd be rolled over by that thing, and when I finally reached the parking lot, I jumped into my car. When I turned the engine over, my headlights flashed to life, illuminating the semi-liquid mound of flesh rolling down the mountainside towards me. I threw my car in reverse, then I burned rubber as I drove down the mountain. My mind strayed towards getting a change of clothes at my house, but I passed by the turn and continued toward the highway. There wouldn't have been time. I needed to keep moving. The worst part is, some of me knows that this thing still knows exactly where I am. It knows where I am, and it's never going to stop coming. If you're on YouTube, thank you for watching. And if you found me on a podcast, thank you for listening. I know I said like 5 videos ago that I've got a Patreon coming, and I still do, but I just have to finish setting it up. You know, life. Click the video on the right to hear more creepypastas, or click the video on the left to hear true, scary stories. Until next time, always look back. Or don't.